All right, so we are now joined by David Dayen. He is the executive editor of the American Prospect and also author of the books Monopolized, Life in the Age of Corporate Power, and Chain of Title, How Three Ordinary Americans Uncovered Wall Street's Great Foreclosure Fraud. David has also been covering, among other topics, trade and the various supply chain woes in the Prospect, so I thought I would have him on today to talk about some of those things. David, good to see you.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me back.
So let's just talk about the supply chain then, because The Prospect recently had an entire special issue where you and several other writers looked at some of the ongoing supply chain woes. And specifically, a few of you argued that it wasn't COVID alone that messed up the supply chain or got us to where we are now, although obviously that was a huge shock. So let's talk about what caused that breakdown, because you guys argue that it was really a long time in the making. What exactly made the supply chain so fragile?
Well, to say it in perfect Jacobin speak, capitalism is
Thank you,
what
David.
happened.
Yeah.
The pandemic, we like to say it was a catalyst, but not a cause of our problems. Our problems go back about 50 years to the way in which corporations essentially pushed along the federal government and governments all around the world to reshape the system of commerce and logistics to their benefit. So what does that mean? That means that we got hyper globalization so that the old story from the former CEO of General Electric, Jack Welch, was that the perfect factory would be built on a barge, so he could move it to each low cost or low environmental or labor standard country that he could find one by one. And that's essentially what happened, not with the barge necessarily, but that corporations were allowed through capital mobility to move their factories to the places that were lowest cost, that were lowest environmental standards and the lowest labor standards. And this concentrated production, particularly in China, but also in some other areas in Southeast Asia. So you had globalization was certainly part of this. Then you had deregulation, which was in order to make it cost effective to get those goods from halfway around the world to where they needed to be in the United States, deregulating particularly the transportation nodes that get us there, shipping, rail, trucking, all of that happened in the 1970s and on also in the Clinton era. There were some other deregulations that happened. So that made it somewhat more cost effective because at the expense of workers, essentially, driving down standards across the board. You also had this revolution, this is sort of managerial revolution in just-in-time logistics, which says we don't need inventories. We will get stuff directly from the factory, get it over to our stores. We won't have to hold it very long because that costs money. And we'll only grab what we need at that particular time and then immediately sell it off to consumers. Those two things, which also led to a lot of monopolization within the system because concentrated production kind of benefited concentrated industries. All of these things made the supply chain much more brittle, much more fragile than it had to be. And this stands to reason, right? If you get everything from one place in China, well, if that one place happens to be the start of a pandemic outbreak, then you're going to have problems. And you're going to rely on these systems that are dominated by a handful of corporations. One of the amazing things we found in our research is that the ocean shipping industry, which became much more important in this time, their earnings in 2021 were equal to the entire industry's earnings from 2010 to 2020 combined. They increased their rates tenfold or more because they were now seen as so vital to getting a scarcer and scarcer amount of goods across the world to various outlets. So you have all of these things that were done in the name of low cost, efficiency, cheap goods. We essentially sold out our own industrial base, gave off all of these various industries to monopolies because we were told in the exchange we would get cheap goods to enhance our lifestyle. And what happened is that this introduced this hidden risk into the system that the pandemic exposed. And now we don't even get the cheap goods.
Right, I was
so
going to say.
the exchange is for nothing, and it created this inflationary environment that we're in. So that's really what happened.
Yeah. So let's fast forward a little bit to the pandemic now. Obviously, we've had this major shock to the supply chain, and you wrote an interesting article recently that looked at how basically for months now people have been saying, "Oh, the supply chain issues are easing, right? Or they're about to ease." And you argue that, well, we actually have some mixed signs. So what does this ambiguity, or what does the kind of vacillation that we're seeing now with these signs regarding the supply chain and whether these issues are easing? What does this tell us about the overall state of the supply chain right now, and also what kinds of supply chain issues we might see in the future?
Well, I think what it tells us is that unless you fix those root causes, those root problems that I just talked about, you're always going to come up against this. And it could be because of a pandemic. And actually, one of the major impediments right now is the fact that the pandemic might be easing in the United States and in parts of the West. But in China, it has now surged. And the city of Shanghai is essentially under lockdown, a major port and export city of 26 million people, where the factories have been shuttered for weeks and weeks and weeks. And that will eventually lead to shortages in the United States because of this globalized system that we have.
Yeah.
But it's not just pandemics, right?
Yeah.
We saw when we had the Freedom Convoy in Canada, that blocked entry of goods into the United States. What we saw just in the last week in Texas, where they increased inspections, the governor, Greg Abbott, increased inspections, presumably so he could find illegal immigrants or drugs or something like that. He ended up finding none of that, but he cost the country a great deal of money because these inspections slowed down the process. They caused food to rot. And it's another example of how fragile this system is because none of it's homegrown and it's all being trucked in. Yeah. Another example is climate change. Yeah. Interestingly, when you look at production in China prior to the recent outbreak, the real impediments to production came over the last year or two since the onset of the pandemic. More of that breakdown came because of climate events. The Yangtze River flooding last summer really had a major impact on being able to distribute goods from Asia to the United States. Because of a heat wave last summer, because of the way in which China's energy system works, a lot of factories had to shut down because they were using too much electricity, particularly for air conditioning. So we see that, and we know that there are going to be more frequent climate and weather-related events in the future. So that can be something that causes this kind of delays in the supply chain. So it's not just pandemics, right? Mm-hmm. It's all of the possible things, whether it's political unrest. I mean, we didn't talk about the huge one, which is the war in Ukraine, which Ukraine and Russia not only are major oil and gas exporters, but major exporters of wheat. And the reason that we're seeing high food prices around the world is largely because of that loss of production in Ukraine, particularly for wheat. So there are all sorts of factors that can cause a supply shock. Mm-hmm. Climate, political unrest, random accidents and fires, or a pandemic. And all of these things end up having the same impact on a system that is too fragile to account for these problems because it's engineered in such a way that you have to have this sort of perfect dance of all this stuff moving in one direction and another. So while we do see some easing because inflation is causing consumer spending to pull back, and we're seeing what is called the bullwhip effect. And what that means is that if you are a supplier, like a retailer, and you're asking for more goods because you see all of these supply disruptions, and you want to make sure that you have stuff in your store to sell, so you double order beyond what you normally would, right? Yeah. So that by the time that gets back to the factory and that factory gets back to you, suddenly we're in a different environment where people aren't buying a bunch of stuff and you're stuck with a bunch of goods. And that's the bullwhip, right? But the second part of that bullwhip is that China stopped producing anything. So if you stop then ordering goods because nobody wants to buy your stuff that you have now, you're going to run out of that inventory eventually for basic necessities in particular, and you're going to have a second bullwhip and more shortages. So I think that's where we might be headed, and it's a really dangerous kind of situation.
Yeah. And in terms of, crafting kinds of measures or policies that might start to ease some of these issues or even address some of the root causes that you talked about, another article that you recently had in the Prospect was looking at a bill that is currently in the House and the Senate. This bill aims to resolve some of these supply chain issues and increase domestic manufacturing. So I want to break it down because there are a couple different components to this bill. Some of those components have bipartisan support. And then, of course, you get into some of the other measures that are a little more contentious. So very broadly, what is in this bill and why is it important? Because it's mostly flown under the radar. What's going on here?
Yeah. So the frustrating thing is this bill has like 3 different names.
Yeah.
So it's hard to say what the bill is, but it's been called the U.S. U.S. Innovation and Competition Act in the Senate. It passes the Competes Act, which is some dumb acronym in the House. And it's also been called by the White House the Bipartisan Innovation Act. So let's just call it Competes, just to make it easier. So what's in Competes? One part of it is funding, essentially subsidies for domestic manufacturing, particularly semiconductors, advanced semiconductor manufacturing. There's about $52 billion in the bill. And I mean, a couple people have said that these are robust industries that don't actually need that amount of subsidies. Bernie Sanders has a legislation to that effect, especially because there is no guarantee that money won't be used for stock buybacks or dividends or anything like that. However, there are a lot of companies that have suggested that they would move some of their production to the United States if this bill passed, and so that I think is driving some of the interest there. So that's one part of it, and that's going to pass. That's pretty much the same in the House and Senate bills. Yep. There's another part of it that is about increasing advanced research and education for these particular kind of science and engineering issues in the United States. Also, there's some slight differences, but that's probably also, pretty similar in the House and Senate bills. That's going to pass. It's like money for the National Science Foundation to add an advanced directorate, create these hubs around the country that would be manufacturing and innovation hubs that would be done through universities. So that's, more education sounds good. So that's the second part. The third part, which actually wasn't even in the bill to begin with, is this trade chapter. And it's become the most contentious part of this bill, even though it didn't exist in the bill before. Right. One part of it, I think, is very important, and that is money for supply chain logistics to identify disruptions, delays, shortfalls in the U.S. supply chain, and to bring critical goods manufacturing back to the United States. And that includes public health issues. That includes various amounts of pharmaceuticals and things of that nature. There's money in the House version of that bill, about $45 billion. There's no money for that in the Senate bill, so they got to figure out what they're going to do there. But then there are these other like purely trade related parts of this that as someone explained it to me, who's sort of on the progressive side, they said, the House bill is something I would fight for. There's a lot of good stuff in the House bill. And the Senate bill, the Senate version of this, the trade chapter, is like if Frankenstein and the werewolf and the Dracula had a baby. Like, it's terrible. And it was largely written by Republicans, Senate Republicans, in conjunction with Ron Wyden, who kind of hews towards the tech industry on some of these issues. And there's a lot of very big tech friendly stuff in that trade chapter, the Senate version. And we can get into the specifics of this. But that's the real sticking point here. And in a bill that's supposed to increase U.S. competitiveness and allow for the ability for U.S. workers to have good paying jobs in manufacturing, advanced manufacturing, and to ease our supply chain issues, why would you create situations that, for example, lowers tariffs on these same kind of goods coming in from China? Yeah. Why would you have things that limit or eliminate inspections on goods coming in from China? Right. Why would you, why would you do all these things? So that's the thing that's going to have to be figured out. Both the House and Senate have passed their versions of these bills by wide margins. There's now a conference committee where they're supposed to work out the differences in the bills between the House and the Senate. And the question is, how are they going to work out these differences? They're so diametrically opposed. Right. Are they going to drop the trade chapter entirely? That doesn't seem tenable, because there are a lot of things like reauthorizations of various trade features, like trade adjustment assistance. When a worker in the United States sees their job outsourced, they can apply for this assistance for new training, healthcare tax credit improvements, childcare expenses, so that they can train and get a new job. Right. And also enhanced unemployment. That has to pass, right? And that's in the House bill, not in the Senate bill. And if it doesn't pass by the end of the year, no trade adjustment assistance will exist. This is a program that's been that's been in effect since the 1960s. So it doesn't seem like you can just drop the trade chapter and pass what you agree on. But also, it doesn't seem like you can figure out an agreement that anyone would be satisfied with. Right. So what do you do? And that's what I explore in that piece.
Right. Yeah. I want to ask kind of a general question about that political deadlock, because the topic of trade when it comes to the Democrats and the Republicans is kind of interesting, right? Because you've got, on the one hand, with the Republicans, now we have this sort of Trump wing that often gestures toward protectionism or, increasing tariffs. On the other hand, as you sort of alluded to earlier, we know that plenty of Democrats historically have helped grease the wheels for bad trade deals in the past. Yeah. So I'm curious, to what extent do you think trade today is a partisan fight? Because in this bill that you're talking about, it seems to break down pretty clearly. But I'm just wondering what you make of those kind of tensions.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, this is kind of a throwback to the old way of thinking about trade, where the Senate is taking a very corporate-friendly line, and the House, in some ways, because the Senate did that, took a very progressive line. And it looks like it breaks down among the parties when there is more kind of there isn't the homogeneity that previously might have existed there. Certainly, Democrats have been responsible for its neoliberal wing of pushing these trade deals that benefit corporations at the expense of U.S. workers. Certainly, over the last few years, at least rhetorically, although maybe not in total practice, there's been this Trump wing that has talked about, that has sort of positioned itself a little more protectionist, put tariffs on China, and was more in opposition to sort of the corporate consensus that we've seen around these issues. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out in the context of this. I think the reason that this has been different so far is that it hasn't been publicized very much. Like, nobody really knows that there's this trade chapter that's like severely different between the House and Senate versions. And so those rhetorical issues that you bring up haven't come to the fore.
Right.
And so I think a lot of Republicans and Democrats don't even know what's in this trade chapter, really.
Right.
And so I think that's the main issue here, is that it's being pushed along by a certain group that still has obvious power in Congress, that can push these corporate friendly lines, particularly around tech. And we can talk about the two very important tech parts of this.
Right.
But I don't think it has risen to the level where it fits into the new trade narrative right now.
Yeah, and I mean that's interesting. I mean, I why do you think that it's gone so under the radar? Because again, just to go back to Trump, I mean, he made trade kind of a centerpiece of his campaign. Other kind of Trump affiliated Republicans were hammering away at that for a while. Why do you think there has been so little attention to this?
Well, as I said, it wasn't the main part of the bill. The
Right.
bill was really supposed to be about semiconductor manufacturing subsidies and more innovation research and education research.
Yeah.
And
Sure.
that's been how the bill has been described. And the trade chapter actually came in very late in the game. The Senate was passing this bill, and all of a sudden, and of course, you need 60 votes in the Senate, so you need Republican support. And Republicans on the Senate Finance Committee said, we need this bill that they threw in called the Trade Act of 2021. They said, we need this in there, or else we're not going to be for the bill. And it threatened passage. And this is a major priority for Chuck Schumer, particularly the semiconductor component. It's a major priority for several Democrats and Republicans in the Senate. And so they essentially bowed to the demands of this small group of Senate Republicans and Ron Wyden on certain other parts of it. And they passed this.
Yeah.
And the House Democrats saw this and said, what is this? Like, what are we looking at here? So they pushed a very progressive version of a trade chapter, kind of to set up a separate poll in the debate, so that now there's this negotiation between two, sides. And if they just passed a normal trade chapter, then it would probably look more like what the Senate passed. So they decided to go, in a much more progressive direction. And so, then they have to find the consensus. But this all happened inside a bill that was projected to the public and even to people in Washington as being about semiconductors and research. And that's why I talked to members who are on the conference committee, like, are the people who are deciding the bill. And they were like, yeah, I'm not familiar with the trade chapter. Why don't you tell me about it? So it is not well known.
Let's maybe talk about some of the big tech specifics that you alluded to earlier, because I think tech is another one of those interesting things where the kind of lines between the Democrats and the Republicans sometimes cross over or get a little muddled. But you talk about something specific in this bill, which you call the Amazon loophole. Talk a little bit about how that works and what's going on with the Senate version.
Absolutely. So anyone who has gone on international travel actually knows what I'm about to talk about here. Because when you go on international travel and you come back to the United States, you get that card, and that card says, how much, what are you declaring that you're bringing in from this other country? And there's usually an amount under which it doesn't have to be inspected.
Yeah.
And that amount is known as the de minimis threshold. So a de minimis amount, a token amount of goods that you bring in doesn't have to be, there's no tariff on it, there's no tax on it, there's no fee, and there's no inspection of it or any kind of record of it. And you just declare it. And you say, yeah, I have, $150 of keychains and T-shirts, and I don't have to go through the customs inspection process for it. Every country has this. But what's different is what that threshold level is at. And in 2015, a bunch of e-commerce firms got Congress to change that de minimis threshold from where it was at $200 to where it is now in the United States at $800. And $800, that is the third largest de minimis threshold in the world. Only Australia and Azerbaijan have a larger de minimis threshold. So what does that mean? Why did e-commerce firms want to change this number? Well, they can get a company in China to ship you something that you bought online directly. And if it's under $800, they don't have to pay tariffs on it. They don't have to pay taxes on it. And it doesn't have to go through any inspection process. You just get it directly from China.
Yeah.
And over 2 million packages a day come in under this de minimis threshold. It is a systematic strategy. I was told of a process where large scale goods are shipped to Mexico and brought to essentially chop shops where they chop them up into packages under $800 and then move them into the United States with no tariff. So obviously this costs the United States money, but I think what's almost more important is the lack of inspection. So that means any kind of counterfeit good, any kind of defective good that can come in without anyone taking a look at it, which normally would be the case under a large scale inspection. The Congress just passed a law preventing the entry of goods from the Xinjiang region of China that are made with forced labor.
Right.
And if they are brought in under this de minimis threshold, there is no way to inspect for that. There is no way to check and see, who actually produced this good and does this comply with our laws? So it's a major way that e-commerce firms get around the whole process of consumer safety and consumer product safety, get around all kinds of tariff laws. And of course, this is like par for the course for Amazon. They try to find arbitrages around, various laws so that they can undercut the competition. And so, yes, it's been called the Amazon loophole because they're the major practitioner of this. So the Senate bill does nothing to this, doesn't change this at all. The House bill put in a change. Earl Blumenauer, who's a congressman from the Portland area, put in this change that said, if you are a country that is on a watch list for counterfeit goods, then you can't use the de minimis threshold. So anything that comes in from that country. It's kind of a laser targeted way of stopping goods that come in from countries that we know are evading the tariff laws, evading the inspection laws through this de minimis loophole to stop them from doing that. So it's an open question whether or not that will be adopted in the final bill, but the House is trying to do it and the Senate hasn't moved on.
Yeah. All right. So maybe just to kind of wrap everything up, the trade issues and the supply chain issues, a final question for you, I guess, is how do we create a more resilient supply chain? And then maybe like a follow-up is, to what extent do you think it's possible at this stage to reshore manufacturing? Because I feel like we do often hear a lot from, progressives and people on the left that like that ship has sailed, right? Like we're not going to get manufacturing back. So actually we should, put more resources into things like care work. And obviously, while I agree with the latter part of that statement, I am also curious as to what you think about the possibilities for reshoring manufacturing.
Yeah, I don't think we can reshore everything. I mean, I don't think that is terribly viable. I think a couple things are viable. First of all, we can nearshore stuff, which will help in the way of reducing the long intermediation of these supply chains. I think is a primary goal here. We have in place a U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement that was much stronger on labor in Mexico in particular. We've seen union elections that threw out the sham company union and put in a real union in these Mexican factories. And, that's kind of the template agreement, but it's the only one in effect right now for what you can do in terms of labor standards in an international trade agreement. So that to the extent that we nearshore stuff to Mexico and Canada, I think that can be useful in not only improving the supply chain, but improving labor standards around the world.
Right.
So that's number one. But I also think that there is room to reshore critical goods. And that's what kind of the House version of this competes bill talks about, which is that we can't get in a situation again where the only people who make personal protective equipment are in a country that is under lockdown. And so our healthcare workers are using trash bags instead of gowns while dealing with a very infectious disease. So whether that means stockpiling and doing a better job of using national stockpiles and warehousing, or whether that means actually bringing back some of these critical goods and having them ready in the event of an emergency, I think there is room to do some of that stuff. And I think you're already seeing it. I mean, with respect to, we mentioned semiconductors, which actually are critical goods. They're used in a lot of medical devices. They're used in, a host of different fields, which are important to our economic security. You see Intel saying they're going to build a factory in Ohio. You see TSMC, which is the world's largest semiconductor manufacturer out of Taiwan, saying they're going to build a factory in Arizona, I believe. Another one, Samsung's doing one in Texas. Like, this is already happening. People are realizing that just-in-time logistics is not a viable thing in a very, volatile world, and that we have to move towards just-in-case logistics, so that we have other possibilities, other options in the event of critical delays and disruptions in the supply chain. I think the experience of the pandemic has shown the business community, actually, that we actually have to do something about this. And government has a role to play in making sure that this happens. And not just through subsidies that are thrown at large corporations, but actually, doing public manufacturing. There are bills to do public manufacturing of generic drugs, for example. The state of California has passed that and could actually today start manufacturing generic drugs. There are public options that I think are available here as well. And then the other part of this is just re-regulating these industries.
Right. A
bill that piggybacked onto the competes situation was this bill called the Ocean Shipping Reform Act. And that got broad bipartisan support in the House, a voice vote in the Senate, so there wasn't even any kind of opposition to it. It's likely going to pass at some point. This would be the first re-regulation of a major industry in the United States since the Cable Act in the 1980s. And it would set standards for the shipping industry so that they can't gouge people with these extortionate prices to ship goods. And that they couldn't charge fees. Like, there are fees charged at the ports to cargo owners to get rid of their goods off the ports when their goods are buried under 20 containers and they can't actually get them out. And it's just extortion. It's just the shipping company saying, yeah, we're going to charge you because we know you can't get the goods out, so we're just going to take money from you. So I think that's important to reverse the kind of tragedy of deregulation that has furthered these problems. And then obviously through competition policy, we can make sure that there's more diversity of supply so that it's not just one company that is creating half the masks in the world or whatever. So I think there are opportunities at all levels of this to get a more resilient supply chain.
All right, David Dayen, again, is the executive editor of The American Prospect, and we will link the Prospect's coverage of supply chain woes in the description box below. David, thank you so much for your time.
All right, great. Thanks for having me.
If you like this video from The Jacobin Show, please hit like and subscribe and share with your friends. Thanks.